So this is going to be a short presentation on how you can get a job at Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and/or Facebook. And from here on out, we'll just refer to those companies as the Big Four. Some people might say Apple should be on the list instead of maybe Facebook, and if you're in electrical engineering, that's fair. But you'll see that the advice from this presentation will generally apply to basically all Silicon Valley tech companies. So just a quick survey. How many of you have actually worked at one of the Big Fours? Right? Why are you here? Okay, maybe you worked at, I don't know, maybe you worked at Microsoft, but you still wanted to get a job at Google. I don't know. I noticed a lot of you put Google as your dream company in our Facebook poll. My name is Sean Lee, and I've interned at 2 of the Big Four, and I've had many friends come up to me and ask me for tips and advice on how they can do the same. So I realized that even though all of the Big Four, they have info sessions at UBC, there's never been a more general guide that applies to all of them. And there should be, because the process of getting a job at Microsoft is not that different from getting a job at Facebook. Process of getting a job at Google, right? Not that different from Amazon. So I thought a talk like this needs to be done, and it needs to be done from a student's perspective. Something really honest and straightforward, because that's an element often missing in the talks that are given by the companies when they're representing themselves. And so because of that disclaimer before we start, I'm not a representative of any of these companies. I'm just currently a student, like all of you. And the things I talk about today will admittedly be anecdotal, but I guarantee you, if you do the things that I say today, you'll be able to land a big job in a big company in a year, whether it's Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, Apple, right, whatever. So these are some of the companies I've interviewed with over the last few years. All of the Big Four is on there, obviously. And these are the companies that I've interned at. NVIDIA, 2013 summer. Amazon, 2014 summer. And Facebook, fall of 2014. So I think I have a fair amount of interview experience. And I'm sure there are more experienced and smarter people that should be giving this talk instead of me. But I really wanted to help out people who are new to the interviewing game and don't even know where to start. Because, I know the struggle. So before we get into the main discussion, though, I wanted to talk about why specifically the Big Four, right? Because there are plenty of other amazing companies out there, and I'm not talking about the idealistic reasons like, oh, you wanna have big impact, right? Or you wanna learn a lot. I'm just talking about it in terms of like your career development. So first is brand equity, right? Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Facebook. These are all names that recruiters have all heard of, right? So, and they're very well known for their pay, their perk, the prestige, and most importantly, the difficulty of their technical interview. So anybody who's worked at one of these companies, right? Anybody who's got one of these companies listed on their resume, they get a stamp that says, I'm at least this good. But which of the Big Four should you go to? And the truth is, when it comes down to choosing between the four, I don't think it matters very much, right? Okay, sure, you get free food at Google and Facebook, or Amazon has the perk of letting you live in downtown Seattle. Microsoft is Microsoft. I've never worked. I've never worked at Microsoft, so I can't say, right? But you aren't going to these companies to eat free food, right? Right? Hopefully not. I mean, what's important is, here's the most important thing, is what you're going to be doing for the 8 hours you're going to work every day. It's your team. It's your project. It's your manager. So I say, once you've worked at any of these companies, it becomes way easier to get an interview with any of the other three. So don't obsess over Google, over Facebook, or Amazon, over Microsoft, or whatever. And besides, right, you're not gonna stay at one company for the rest of your life. And then there's the fact that even if you don't really like big companies, it's easier to start from the Big Four and then move to a smaller company than the other way around, because again of that, I'm at least this good stamp on your resume. Now that's not to say that there aren't smaller companies that aren't just as competitive, or maybe more so, like companies like Dropbox, Snapchat, Quora, Palantir, and other really hot Silicon Valley tech companies. They're known to have extremely high bars for their technical interviews, and appropriately so. Like, does anybody want to guess like how much Dropbox pay their interns? Nobody wants to guess.
6 grand.
More. Somebody else.
8.
More.
10.
Lower than 10. So yeah, what I've seen on Glassdoor is $9,000 a month, which is pretty ridiculous for an intern. Snapchat, I heard, also pays $9,000 a month. Quora, $8,200 a month. Zynga pays 8,000 too, actually. So which brings me to my second point, which is pay. This is something companies, when they represent themselves on the stage, they won't tell you exactly. And I can't tell you like, because I can't tell you exactly like what the numbers are. I don't know myself, and for what I got paid, I shouldn't mention it. But you can look up the numbers on Glassdoor.com, and that should give you a pretty good idea. I think all of the intern salaries at the Big Four is at least 5,000 a month, and that varies depending on your experience and the position. So get an internship at any one of these four companies, and there's your full tuition, right? I think the average co-op student at UBC, at least in ComSci, I think I heard that they make something in the 2,000s a month. So this is a big step up. But again, there are companies, like I mentioned, that pay even more out there. So why the Big Four? And here's the thing about the Big Four, right? Versus the smaller companies. Because of their size, they don't hire iOS developers or front-end developers. They just hire software engineers. Because there's no really reason to differentiate them for entry-level positions. So if you know Java, and that's all you know, but you're a hell of an engineer with Java, they'll have a position for you. If you know Python and that's all you know, they'll have a position for you. And if you know Ruby and that's all you know, but they don't have a position for you, chances are they'll make a position for you. Right? Languages can actually be taught fairly quickly. But the same can't be said about fundamental computer science concepts, right? The way you think as a programmer, your reasoning skills, your logic, your communication skills, that can't be taught overnight. I didn't know any PHP when I started at Facebook, and to be honest, I still don't. But that's all I did there. The industry is really good right now, and the Big Four, they're desperate for great coders, right? They're always hiring. And due to their size, they also have more resources to hire more people, more open positions, more recruiters, more outreach. So this is sort of anecdotal, but I've personally had way better success rates with the Big Four than the local companies in Vancouver, at least as far as getting the interview goes. So I'd like to make the argument that as long as you're a smart person that knows how to code, it's easier to get a job at the Big Four than the smaller companies who might be looking for people who have a little bit more specific skill sets. So if you didn't want to work at the Big Four prior to coming here, I don't know why you're here, but hopefully you're convinced now. So how can you get a job at the Big Four? Well, it's actually quite simple. And after years of interviewing, I think I've finally cracked it, right? I've devised the idiot's guide to getting a job at the Big Four, and it's real simple, okay? Real simple. I broke it down into 2 steps for you. Okay, step 1 is get an interview somehow. Okay, and step 2 is do well in the interview. Okay, I know. Okay, so most of you are sitting here thinking, well, duh, wasn't that obvious? What a waste of time it was to show up. But listen to me carefully. Like, that's just the thing. That's just the thing. It is obvious. It is obvious. So why do I have so many people coming up to me asking for advice as if there was some secret trick to it or something? I said it's simple. I didn't say it was easy. Well, let's break this down, right? So let's talk about step 1. Get an interview somehow. So to get an interview, you have to apply with a resume. But what goes on your resume? So here's mine. I can't tell you objectively if it's a great resume or not, because I'm biased, but it succeeded in me getting jobs. So I guess it's decent. And it's better to use mine than someone else's. I've seen way too many students with 2-page resumes, and they don't even have a single year of relevant work experience. And that's not to say that you working part-time at Starbucks to help pay your tuition is a bad thing. And in fact, if you don't have any other work experience, definitely leave it in. But your resume shouldn't be 2 pages long. Your recruiter will probably spend a few seconds, 10 seconds maybe tops, spending time on your resume, because remember, like, they have hundreds of applications to sift through. So every single line, every single character should deliberately answer the question, why should we hire this person? I think I do a pretty good job of doing that here. I don't just talk about what I did or what my responsibilities were, but I talk about the impact I had that company, quantitative, that's measurable, like reducing daily error rate by 75%, or improving startup time by up to 10 seconds. And if you're curious why Amazon section is blank, still under non-disclosure agreement. So here's the bottom half of my resume. What if you don't have any work experience? We all have to start somewhere, of course. And the recruiters, they do understand that, right? Otherwise, nobody would have jobs. And I gotta tell you, I think we're really lucky to live in a time when the laptops we carry around with us is just as good as the laptops that professional software engineers will be using at work, right? You can't say the same for a lot of the other industries. So what's stopping us from working on personal projects or contributing to open source projects, right? The answer is nothing, of course. But what should your personal project be? That's the question I get a lot. Well, it's whatever you want it to be, right? What do you want to do? Where do you see yourself going with your career? If you want to work on the front page of Amazon.com, design and make your own beautiful web page, and it can be your online portfolio. If you want to work on Microsoft Xbox team, make a video game for Xbox. If you want to work on Google's Android OS, contribute something. It's open source, right? And if you want to work on Facebook's mobile app, then make your own iOS app or Android app. Now, there's literally nothing stopping you from doing this right now. So I say just do what you want, put it on your GitHub, and then put your GitHub on your resume, on your LinkedIn. Now you have experience and stuff to put on your resume. Also, working on side projects, it shows the recruiters that you're really passionate about what you do, right? Now, if you don't have the discipline to set aside time to work on your side projects, consistently and in a great way, you can participate in a hackathon. How many of you here were at Global Game Jam this year? Right? So this is our first problem. Not very many. Now that's a great way to produce something that's working over a weekend, right? Because now you're in an artificially constrained amount of time, but the pressure's not all on you because you have a team. So you'll learn a lot, and you'll also meet a lot of new people. So participate in as many hackathons as you can. Anybody here know who John Carmack is? Okay, who's John Carmack?
The guy who former in software, pretty much lead software designer.
Yeah. So right now he's the CTO of Oculus VR, right? You guys heard of that company? Oculus VR is a virtual reality company. Facebook bought it last year for $2 billion. And John Carmack is the CTO of that. And he's also the guy who made Doom along with John Romero. He tweeted this recently. He didn't write it, but he just tweeted as a food for thought. Let me just read it out. The ceramics teacher announced on opening day that he was dividing the class into two groups. All those on the left side of the studio, he said, would be graded solely on the quantity of the work they produced. All those on the right, solely on the quality. His procedure was simple. On the final day of class, he would bring in his bathroom scales and weigh the work of the quantity group. 50 pounds of pod rated an A, 50 pounds of B, and so on. Those being graded on quality, however, needed to produce only one pod, albeit a perfect one, to get an A. Well, came grading time, and a curious fact emerged. The works of highest quality were all produced by group being graded for quantity. It seems that while the quantity group was busily churning out piles of work and learning from their mistakes, the quality group had sat theorizing about perfection and in the end had little more to show for their efforts than grandiose theories and a pile of dead clay. Something to think about. It'll take a lot of work until your personal projects reaches a level of quality that you'll be happy with. You may never be happy with it. And I hope you aren't, to be frank. You may go through several projects before you finally produce something that you're proud of to add to your portfolio. And I understand, it might be daunting. But today I want to challenge you all to something, okay? I want to challenge you all. Who here has heard of Jennifer DeWalt? Nobody. Okay. So she's the person that made one website every day for half a year. And not to imply what DeWalt did is nothing short of amazing, but if she could make 180 websites in 180 days without any coding background beforehand, I'm sure, right? I'm sure computer science students and engineering students at a top 40 school can at least make an Android applications in a few months. So I challenge you today. Make something. Make something and break some pots along the way. Next thing to put on your resume, list programming languages, list technologies you know how to use. If you have no relevant work experience, list some coursework. By the way, if your GPA is anything less than a 3.0, leave it out of your resume. I think even 3.0 is probably a little low, but it's okay. The truth is, companies, they don't really care about your GPA anymore, right? Google, they were notorious for asking for your GPA, but even they've come out and said that they found no correlation between performance at work and school GPA. They will still ask for it, though, I guess, for data collection purposes to continue confirming their hypothesis. Okay, so with that, we have a resume. You can either apply online, or you can hand in your resume at the career fair. And I apologize that it's already March, because I really wanted to do this presentation earlier, but, hesitated for a long time. So it's probably too late to apply for a summer internship. But there is always fall internships. And that's an option, I think, even if you're not in the co-op program. Just take a leave of absence from school for a term or a year. That's actually what I did to intern at Facebook, because it was during September, right? Once I had an offer from both Amazon and Facebook, I had to ask myself, was it more important to me to graduate 4 months earlier or to work at both of these companies? Because even if I graduate, if I don't have a full-time offer, right, what does it matter? So I had 2 chances to get a return offer. I had 2 opportunities to work in 2 different companies, 2 very different teams. So that's what I did. Now, I'm not sure if engineering program is as flexible as science, so that you can just, leave for a term. But anyways, apply for a fall internship. If you can't, there's always next year. And of course, if you're graduating, this restriction doesn't apply to you. So just apply. Just apply to these companies. It's free, right? But you can't get that interview unless you apply. For cover letters, I don't encourage nor discourage them. I doubt recruiters at Big Four have time to read them if they only spend several seconds looking at your resume. But if you're applying to a smaller company, right, maybe Snapchat or something, and you're really passionate about Snapchat, that might make a difference. Okay. Here's something a little bit more unconventional. I'm sure you've known that you have to apply for a resume, of course. Companies don't tell you this often for some reason, but another way to get interviews are programming challenges. So who here has heard of Twitch? Okay, you. Yes. Yeah.
The streaming platform, or?
Right. So they're the video game streaming website, and Amazon actually bought them last year for $1 billion, right? So I was able to get an interview at Twitch because they had a coding challenge that asked you to write an AI that played a bidding game, and it would run your AI against all the other submissions. And I wrote a simple program and they allowed unlimited number of submissions, so I kept on adjusting it until I was ranked like 22nd out of 400 something submissions. Once I decided this is probably good enough, I sent in an application. And in this case, I sent in a cover letter too, and I mentioned, hey, I'm the dude in 22nd place. Sure enough, they gave me an interview. Anyone here heard of Box? Okay, what does Box do? Sorry.
It's just a file upload service.
Yeah, so they're similar to Dropbox. I'm sure most of you have heard of Dropbox at least. Box has a more of an enterprise focus, and they recently had an IPO, right? For now, I think they're worth $2.2 billion. So they had a few challenges on Interview Street, and one of them was like, implement an LRU cache. I solved it and got an interview. Now, even if I don't get the job offer or the interview, I consider it good practice, right? Evernote, for example. A lot of you probably heard of Evernote as well. They never gave me an interview after I solved all their challenges. And that's no big deal, because now I have an implementation of a circular buffer I can put on my resume. Another way to get an interview at the Big Four is a referral. If you know someone that works at the Big Four, not me though, ask them nicely to give you a referral. Because as long as they don't hate you and they think you have a pretty good chance, they'll likely agree, because there's a big incentive for them. They get a referral bonus. I gave some of my friends referrals at Facebook, and a few of them got hired, and that was a significant chunk of change. So very big incentive for them. And not only that, but the companies, right? They understand this. They understand that candidates they find through referrals statistically have a much higher chance of getting hired. Take a look at this. Stanford acceptance rate, 5.1%. That's actually not that bad, right? That's 1 out of 20. For Google, many estimates out there, but this source that I listed, it says 0.23%. That's 1 out of 430. So that's 21.5 times harder than Stanford. But the good news is this number is much, much higher for candidates that have been referred. And the recruiters, they know this. And because the recruiters, they get bonuses when they successfully hire someone, obviously they'll pursue the candidates that have a higher chance of getting hired, right? So getting a referral should at least guarantee that your resume is actually looked at by an actual person, and it dramatically increases your chances of getting an interview. And of course, both option 2 and 3, you do need to apply with a resume in the end. That's step 1 applies to everything. And so that's step 1. Let's talk about step 2. So a week later, after you apply, you'll get an email saying, we want to schedule an interview. What should you expect? All of the Big Four, they're usually on campus to do on-site interviews after career fairs, because that's when they get a bunch of applications. So you can expect to do some coding in person, either on paper or more usually a whiteboard. Of course, depending on the timing, if there aren't any interviewers or recruiters on campus at the time, all of the companies will interview you over the phone. And they'll use something like Collab Edit for the code, or in case of Google, they'll use Google Docs. For internships, Amazon and Google, they do 45-minute back-to-back interviews. Facebook, they do one 45-minute interview. And if you make it through, they'll fly you out to their California or more likely the Seattle office, since we're at UBC, for one more 45-minute on-site interview. And they'll give you a tour of the campus as well. Microsoft, similar, they come to our campus to do a 45-minute interview. And if you pass, they'll fly you out to Redmond. But unlike Facebook, they do 4 back-to-back 45-minute interviews. For Google, if you make it through the phone interviews, they'll set you up with host matching interviews. So you end up on the team that you actually like to work on. This means, though, that even if you did really well in your coding interviews, there is a good chance that you might not get the job if you didn't want any of the teams or none of the teams wanted you. Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft, they'll ask for your preferences and do their best to match up with a team that you'd like, but you really don't have the final say. But it does mean that you're guaranteed the job as long as you pass the coding interviews. For full-times, all 4 companies, very similar processes. It's 1 or 2 45-minute phone screen, and then 4 back-to-back 45-minute interviews on their campus, with a lunch break in between usually. Okay, but what will they ask you during these interviews? If you went through the co-op interviews, how many of you here are in co-op? Okay. If you went through the co-op interviews or interviews with some of the local companies in Vancouver, let me tell you first of all that it'll probably be nothing like that. The Big Four and tech companies in Silicon Valley will all be spending 80 to 100% of the time asking coding questions. So I hope you guys all have a pen or something, because you need to write this down. There are 2 Bibles. There are 2 Bibles of programming interviews, right? Number 1 is cracking the coding interview, CTCI. And number 2 is programming interview exposed, or PI. So, cracking the coding interview, in my opinion, that's by far the best resource for interview prep. It's basically a bunch of interview questions, and they have solutions, detailed solutions at the back. So, in the past, I've actually been asked questions right out of this book a few times. If you feel comfortable with your data structure and algorithms, you can dive right into CTCI. But if you're new to interviews and you want to review some fundamental concepts first, I recommend starting out with Pi, since it goes into more detailed explanations. Skip any sections about brain teasers. Nobody asks those anymore. They're useless. Google used to be notorious for asking them, and they found that it doesn't help predicting a candidate's performance at work. Don't pay attention to those. Do not skip sections about object-oriented programming and design. But I would say don't focus too much time on them, because for interns and new grad hires, they usually want to know if you just know how to code. But you will get design questions for sure. I'm just saying the focus is still on coding. And so on that note, everybody should do all the sections about data structures and algorithms like arrays, trees, recursion, sorting, and whatnot. But for sections like networking and databases, you have to use your own discretion. They probably won't ask you like a database question if you didn't have SQL on your resume and you're applying for a position to write firmware in C, right? So the other thing is, I've interviewed with all of the Big Four multiple times, and I've never been asked behavioral questions. The behavioral question, I guess, is the entirety of the interview. Your tone, your mannerisms, your body language, your communication skills throughout the entire interview. And as long as it doesn't raise a huge red flag, like you said something really offensive, you'll be okay. Because again, the 90% of the focus is on can you code. Depending on the company, the question will either be decided at the discretion of the interviewer, or the company will have a list of questions that are in rotations that the interviewer may ask. So go on Glassdoor.com or Career Cup and look up interview questions that were asked for the position you're applying for recently. Because if somebody broke their NDA and decided to post their questions on there, you might get lucky and be asked the same one. But if not, it's still good practice. But I wouldn't prioritize these questions over the ones in CTCI because, again, there aren't detailed solutions for you to work with. I personally really like LeetCode. They have solutions to most of the questions they have up on there. And I'd say on average, they're actually more challenging than the ones I found in CTCI. So it's excellent practice. HackerRank, TopCoder, Geeks for Geeks, they're all very similar in function. You can pick and solve a coding problem on your computer online. But for the purposes of preparing for your interviews, you really want to get used to whiteboard coding, not keyboard, because that'll likely be the format of your technical interviews. But of course, if you exhaust all other sources, check it out, or if you just like doing this kind of thing. Now the key is this. The key is this. How you're going to practice these questions. If it's at all possible, what I don't want you to be doing is sitting down at home and coding these by yourself. Out of all the things I'm going to be saying today, if all of it so far was information you already knew, this is the one thing you should really take away, okay? This method of interview prep really works. It really works. So what I want you to do is I want you to find a friend, right? Or two. I don't think anything bigger than a group of 3 will work because too many ideas and distractions, it'll start to get in the way. 2 ideally, 3 max. And try to find people who are, around your level of experience so you all benefit equally. The day before you meet, you guys all solve a coding problem first, different ones from any of the sources I might have mentioned. Make sure you understand it thoroughly. And then when you meet, one of you acts as the interviewer, and then the other acts as the interviewee. Your job as the interviewee is to solve the problem, obviously. Ask any questions to remove the ambiguities, like what could the input be? Make sure you talk the problem over and discuss high-level approach before you start writing any code. Make sure you're enunciating what you're thinking along the way, explaining why you're doing it the way you are doing as you write down code. Your job as the interviewer, it isn't to go against them, but it's to pick their head for what they know and poke them gently in the right direction if they get really lost. And this is what real interviewers will do. Now, these mock interviews, they're not only important because it's practice of the real thing, but now because you're on the other side of the fence. And what you'll quickly realize is that the best solution to a problem is not the fastest one. It's not the simplest one, but the one that the interviewer already thinks is the best solution. Now, the solution that the interviewer knows, of course, it'll most usually be the best one, but not always. And that is confirmation bias. The interviewers are trained not to be biased, of course, but their day job is engineers, right? Interviewing is their side thing, and you have to remember they're humans, just like you. So if you're asked to print all possible permutations of a string, you decide to do it iteratively, the interviewer will probably ask, can you do this any other way? Now, of course you can do this iteratively, but what's the simpler way? Can anybody shout it out? Recursion, right. So, iterative works, but if the interviewer was expecting the recursive solution, that's the one you should give. If he asked you if it's possible to do it any other way, big hint, you need to do it another way. Now, if you know an objectively better way to do it, I don't know, maybe it's faster, big O, because of some crazy algorithm you learned in CompSci 420 or whatever, right? Mention that. But unless you understand it well enough to teach it to the interviewer yourself, he probably won't be convinced that you know what you're talking about. Now, just do these mock interviews for an hour or two, 3 or 4 times a week, and it starts to get fun to blow through all the questions, and you'll gain more confidence as you start to pick up momentum. And now this is what happens, right? What happens is, once you master a question, if this is like your knowledge map right here, right? Once you master a question, you get a dot, boom, right? And you get another dot, another question, boom, 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 boom. And some people, they're better at this than others, of course, but no matter who you are, once you have enough of these dots, it becomes trivial to connect them. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Any sort of question like finding out if two strings are anagrams of each other, finding the intersections of two lists, or finding duplicates in an array, they all follow the same pattern. You do brute force, and that's O(n) squared running time with O(1) memory. You sort, that's O(n) log n running time with O(1) or O log n memory usage, depending on what sorting algorithm you use. And you can use a hash table, and that's O(n) memory with O(n) or O(n) running time with O(n) memory. Now, depending on whether you're in a memory constrained environment or not, you'd probably say that the best answer is the hash table approach or the sorting approach, and you'd be right. I've been asked so many questions that follow this pattern for my interviews. The companies, they love asking this for entry-level positions. Or, back to that permutation of string example, right? Maybe instead of all permutation, now they're saying all permutations of length m, where m is less than the length of the original string. Or maybe not all permutation, but now they want all combinations, right? Because the order doesn't matter. You may have never done a question like that before. But if you did the string permutation, and you've understood it thoroughly, you'd be able to immediately recognize this is a recursion problem, and go from there. And that's step 2. Maybe some of you came to this event hoping for some easy tricks to get a job at the Big Four. It doesn't exist, right? There is no such thing. But there is an easy trick to get a full-time job at the Big Four, and that's you go through the easier internships, right? You saw like how the full-time is all 4 back-to-back 45-minute interviews. So you go through the easier internship interviews, and you work your ass off, and you get a return offer. The only exception to that is actually Google. They'll make you do another interview at the end of your internship if you want a return offer. I told you, it's simple, but it's not easy. And that's the good news, because if it was easy, everybody would be making 6 figures, right? Everybody would be at the Big Four making 6 figures. But I can tell you, if I look at my friends that went to the Big Four last year and the ones that didn't, what separated them from the others was that they were doing these mock interview practice sessions regularly. So let's survey the room, right? How many of you have never applied to the Big Four? There's your problem. Step 1. You have to get the interview, and to get the interview, you have to apply. I want to ask, how many of you have actually applied, you've interviewed, and you've been rejected? Hoping for more of you here, but I guess not. And that is step 2, right? It comes out to more practice. But here's the thing, right? This shit about step 1, step 2 is deceiving, because they're not 2 separate steps. They're not 2 separate steps that go from 1 to 2. It's part of your life, and you're always working on them at the same time, right? You're always working on your resume. You're always working on personal projects. You're always practicing. This isn't school anymore, guys, right? It's not about school anymore. When you walk into that interview, and once the 45 minutes are up, there is no 60%. There is no 70%. There is no 80%, right? There is higher or no higher. But listen to me carefully. The interviewer, they can limit you to 45 minutes, but they can't limit how much you prepare beforehand. If you look at professional athletes, right? They're not going, oh, I got a big game schedule next week. I got to start training. No. Training is part of their job. And I'm telling you, if you're a student right now and you want to become a software engineer, you want to become a software developer, you got to train. You got to start training. You got to start practicing. That's your job. So, it's story time. Let me tell you a story about my friend Mike. Is he here today? Mike? Hey, Mike.
What's up, buddy?
Nah, I gotta talk about you for a second, Mike, because he went on some co-op terms before, and they weren't really programming jobs, right? And last year around January, he saw me doing these interview prep sessions, and I invited him over to my place because I had a whiteboard at home, and we just started doing these mock interviews together. And then when the career fair rolled around, we probably both applied to like 30 or 40 different companies. And because I already worked at NVIDIA, right? That's a pretty big name. I didn't have any problem getting the interviews, but he was getting discouraged, because he wasn't getting anything. And I told Mike, Mike, you can't get discouraged. Like this preparation we're doing right now, it isn't for a specific event. It isn't for a specific interview, right? This is part of our lives now. If you get nothing this year, you're just preparing for next year. And guess what happened? Amazon was on campus that week. I think they were there Wednesday and Thursday. And on Tuesday, one of the recruiters called him and said, "We got an interview slot that just freed up. Do you want to interview with us?" You know, I guess Mike was on the bottom of the stack or whatever because I had that interview 2 weeks earlier. But anyway, he had, you know, he said he had class, but he said, of course I do the interview. And you know what happened? Last summer, Mike and I, we both went to Amazon together, and we'll be returning there this summer or August for full time. Now, Mike's a smart guy, but I think he would agree, right? If he didn't keep up with those mock interview sessions, even when he didn't have any interview schedule, he might not have made the cut. Listen to what I'm saying carefully. Like, if you start preparing after you get the interview schedule, you might already be too late. My friend, Seyoung, is here too. Seyoung? He didn't really have any big renowned companies prior to 2014, okay? Well, we did the same thing. We met twice a week. We did interview prep sessions, for about 2 hours a day. And then he got Amazon. And then he got a Thinking Ape. That's probably one of the hardest companies to get into in Vancouver. And he's returning to Facebook this summer. Is Fee here? Right, Fee? Fee, my boy. Man. He didn't have any job prior to 2014, right? He skipped the midterm just so that he can do nothing but prep for the interview with Amazon, like nonstop. And he's interned there last summer, and he's going back there full time. Now, I'm not saying like skip your midterms. That was not ideal. But I'm saying you need to be able to make some sacrifices if you really want that job. That's the kind of attitude you need to have. Now, if you still don't think you have what it takes to get a job at the Big Four, if you still don't believe what I'm telling you today, let me just be honest with you right now, okay? For real. I'm probably the dumbest person in this room. Like, how many of you took ComSci 221, right? What's the electrical engineering? What's the equivalent of that? Somebody just yell it out.
OnSite 221.
Okay, so you all know what I'm talking about, yeah? Okay. I didn't know there was an equivalent. Okay. So, y'all know what I'm talking about. That basic algorithms and data structure course, right? That's what basically all the interview questions are based on. I failed that course. And I took it again and I passed with a 51%. How many of you took ComSci 310? I don't know what's the equivalent of that, but that's the software engineering course, right? Yeah, somebody just yell it out, please, so we all know what I'm talking about.
ECESS 310.
Okay. So, the software engineering course. Like that's my job title, right? That's my job title. And I failed that course too. My GPA is 2.3. I've been on academic probation for the last 4 years. I got rejected from the co-op program. And when I graduate this May, it'll be taking me 6 years to get a 4-year degree. Okay, like I've had people coming up to me telling me like, oh, they're jealous, but they don't know, right? Like there was a time in my life, like I skipped 2 classes for 2 weeks so that I can just do these interview preps. And like nobody wanted to do that much interview prep, right? So like I talked to Mike and I was like, Mike, you're gonna be the Monday and Wednesday guy. And Seyoung, you be the Tuesday and the Thursday guy. And Chris, you be the Friday guy, right? It took me 5 rejections with the Big Four before I finally got a job with them. And I'm not talking about like, I don't even count the times I applied and I never heard back. I'm talking about I went in, I interviewed, and they told me I'm not good enough. But here's the great thing about resumes, right? Here's the great thing about resumes. You don't need to put down how many times you failed on your resume. So if you're that crazy good Russian programmer guy in your class and you can get a job offer with all of the Big Four in a single try, and you're like me, you're an idiot like me, and it took you 5 tries, it doesn't matter. Our resumes look the same. You don't have to put down how many times you failed on your resume. Remember that Steve Jobs speech at Stanford, and at the end, he mentioned the quote, stay hungry, stay foolish. If you feel stupid in class right now because all of the stuff you're learning, none of it makes sense, know that this is an advantage, okay? Be foolish enough to dare to think you can work at the top companies in the world. It doesn't matter if your GPA is 2.3. It doesn't matter if you've never had a job before. All of my friends, myself included, we never had a reason to think that we can work at the top companies in the world. But we were all foolish, and we were hungry enough to try anyways. And then we got it. So listen to me. Like I only have about 7 minutes left before I leave you. I know that the career fair is done and over with, and some of you sitting in this room, you're here because you interviewed with them. You've interviewed with them last month, and you thought it was too hard, right? And you're discouraged and you're thinking of giving up. And I'm saying, like, don't be discouraged. Luck plays a really big role in interviews. Okay, sometimes you get an interviewer that's really good. He'll guide you in the right direction without giving away any answers. Sometimes you'll get the ones that just silently sit there checking emails. You might have been really anxious. You might have been sick. You might have never seen a question, anything like that before, and you just choked. Or maybe you were everything they were looking for, but they just had other people with more experience that happened to have applied around the time when you applied. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying skill doesn't matter. But skill only improves your luck. And the easiest way to improve your luck is to keep applying, keep practicing, and keep interviewing. Good luck. And thank you all so much for your time today.